All right, folks, this is our last little mini lecture for chapter 14. Aren't you excited? I am. Okay, so let's talk about the different forms of epidemiology, which is the study of how diseases are transmitted, etc. And there are really three major types of epidemiology. And a given epidemiologist might engage in different types of epidemiology at different points, but any given like project or study would fall under one of these categories. So first we have descriptive epidemiology, and that's really just looking at data and looking at where the location and time and cases of the disease are getting patient information, and they're trying to usually identify the index case or the first incident of disease in a particular region or city or whatnot to try to understand how that's spreading. And think back to that little video clip that was glitching out when we were looking at that SARS case where they were talking about the physician who entered the hotel, was sick, didn't know it, and ended up infecting other people in the hotel, and then they all left and went home and infected other people. So they were identifying that index case in that scenario. Right, so that's descriptive epidemiology. Analytical epidemiology is trying to do things like understand the cause and the modes of transmission and then how to prevent that. And think about this current situation with COVID-19. We already now know the cause, right? It's the SARS-CoV-2 virus. They understand at least one of the modes of transmission, which is the respiratory droplet transmission, which falls under that contact transmission. But there's questions about whether it can be aerosolized and be airborne transmission. Even I've read little bits about fecal oral transmission. They've found it in the feces of infected individuals. So now they're wondering, could that be a mode of transmission? So once they understand all the modes of transmission, then they can come up with the methods of prevention, right? But if we don't understand how it's transmitted, it's awfully hard to figure out what that how to prevent it if we don't understand the transmission. So obviously you have to look back at what has been happening. Oftentimes there's a lot of this type of study after the outbreak has already sort of calmed down. Right now we're in the midst of the outbreak and they're still involved in these types of studies. The last type is experimental, and that's really just testing a hypothesis. So let's just say we are wondering if fecal oral route of transmission is possible. We can't obviously test it on people, but if there was an animal model, you could then set up the experiment to see whether that was potentially the case. So we're really applying Koch's postulates to test a particular hypothesis in the laboratory to answer a question that is related to the epidemiology. Well, John Snow was really the first epidemiologist. He's considered the father of epidemiology. And there is a really good book in the library called The Ghost Map. I guess you can't really check it out from the library at this moment, but you can order it on Amazon. There's an extra credit assignment associated with this. So if you're in the mood to do some extra reading, this is an interesting story about how John Snow, a physician back in the 1850s, figured out what was causing the cholera outbreak that was occurring in London. It's a really interesting read about the state of sanitation in London back then and how this cholera was spreading. But what he did was took a scientific approach, which had not been taken prior to this point, where this cholera outbreak was starting to rage through London. And he had a suspicion that perhaps water was a means for transmitting this infection. And so he took a map of London and he started walking the blocks, talking to people in each of the houses and figuring out whether people within the house was infected or not. And he would just put a pin into the map where residents were infected, where people had been infected. And as you can see, that there was a lot of infections that were centered on this pump that was located on Broad Street. So these pumps were where people got their drinking water. And there was quite a few around the city, but this particular pump had a large cluster of infections. Interestingly, this pump had a reputation for having the best tasting water, so people would travel a little further just to get the water from Broad Street Pump. So that kind of answers why there might be some spread from around this particular pump, right? So he eventually convinced the authorities to remove the handle from this pump so people could not get water from this pump, and the cholera epidemic kind of petered out. So he was right. That pump had been contaminated, and people were picking up cholera from that pump. Why is it not advancing? Hello. Come on. There we go. So we're going to talk in this last little bit about infections that are acquired in a healthcare setting. You might look at some of these terms. Maybe some of them seem a little bit familiar to you, like idiopathic, nosocomial, congenital, neoplastic. What term actually is applied to diseases that are acquired in a healthcare setting? Well, it's actually nosocomial. So that's what we're going to talk about right now. The term either healthcare associated infection or nosocomial infection is interchangeable. A lot of places are using the HAI designation for healthcare associated infection, but nosocomial means the same thing, and you will also see that referenced in various reports. And hospitals have to be very concerned with trying to reduce greatly, hopefully eliminate nosocomial infections. It's not always possible because not all of them are within their control, but a lot of it is. Okay, so if you look at this figure down below, you'll see how different components intersect to give us that nosocomial infection. So let's take a look at how nosocomial infections occur. So the first here is exogenous, which means that the pathogen itself was acquired from the healthcare setting. Now this is within the hospital's sanitation practices control, because that means that the patient came in and acquired the pathogen from the environment itself. So this is the greatest concern of hospitals. They do not want to be responsible for these types of infections, right? So sanitation, proper techniques are what's going to eliminate exogenous types of healthcare associated infections. Now, endogenous is a little bit less within their control, because this is what happens from normal microbiota. Okay, so the patient is in there, and then something that the patient maybe already had been exposed to is going to cause them to become infected. So super infections. Now, if the patient already had a low level of Clostridium difficile or C. diff within their flora and then became immunocompromised, that C. diff can then emerge and cause them a huge problem. But then if that C. diff were to be passed from that patient to another patient, that becomes exogenous, and that has to be prevented, right? So endogenous means that the patient's own flora is causing them a problem because of the situation that they're in. So that's a little bit more difficult to manage for the healthcare setting, but something that they do definitely have to try to keep on top of. Now, iatrogenic is referring because of the medical procedure. So perhaps the person had surgery and the skin was not totally sanitized before the surgical wound was made, and now the pathogen gets in there. So it's a little bit of endogenous, but it's definitely because of the procedure itself that the person has resulted with that infection. So that's the iatrogenic. And then super infections are, as we mentioned before, a secondary infection that the person gets because they're already weakened by the first infection. And there might be a little bit of flavors of endogenous microbiota, right, that are causing the super infection. Or, somebody had the measles, for example, and then they recover, but we now know that messes with the person's immunological memory, and then they get another infection like a pneumonia because they're recovering from the measles, right? So those are super infections, but these are all different types of nosocomial or healthcare associated infections that can occur, and hospitals do need to try very hard to stay on top of it. especially the exogenous type. They do not want to be responsible for introducing a pathogen to a patient that did not walk into the hospital with that pathogen. So there are a lot of agencies that are responsible for public health. You're probably hearing a lot about these different agencies right now in the news. The overarching one for us here in the United States is the United States Public Health Service, and that's where the CDC is underneath, and you'll be hearing about these different branches underneath the United States Public Health Service and different public announcements that are coming through related to this COVID-19 problem. And also you're probably hearing a lot about the World Health Organization, which is an agency where the globe, right, the different nations have come together and try to coordinate a public health service for the globe, right? So their primary charge for all of these agents is to limit disease transmission. So you're hearing a lot about them now and what they're recommending to try to prevent this COVID-19 from devastating the human population. They do things like monitor water and food safety under more normal circumstances. They're also the ones that are establishing the isolation and quarantine measures. So they're supposed to be telling us what to do and the best practices. They are also in charge of the vaccine distribution. So once we do have a vaccine for this particular virus, they're the ones that will be deciding how that gets distributed, what the priorities are and whatnot, because there will not be enough at first for everybody, right? So they also their charge is to educate the public and also to limit the disease spread, right? And so we're hearing a lot about these public health agencies in this particular moment. So I'm sure you've heard about the CDC prior to this particular moment in time. Sometimes my other classes hadn't really heard too much about CDC, but the CDC is all over the news right now, so I'm quite sure you have heard of them, and they are a great source of information on lots of different diseases. So if you have questions, I recommend you visit their site and learn a little bit. Okay, so this is the end of chapter 14, and I hope you now have a better understanding of some of the terminology and things that epidemiology encompasses, and we'll be entering into our immune system in the next set of lectures. All right, take care, everybody. Stay safe.